Okay, good morning. This is actually going to be partially the next sort of little chunk of this, but I'm also going to have to actually go back because I just realized that when this whole isolation, COVID, canceling class thing all happened, it happened right in the middle of me finishing up in Polynesia, and I forgot about poor old Rapa Nui or Easter Island, which I actually don't even have in the PowerPoint slides because I usually just find it from one semester to the next, it's just easier just to talk about it. So what we're going to actually look at is ties into the short video I just sent you guys as an assignment, as a reaction, which is a little 5-minute video on Madol, and the questions attached to that. So this is going to be a little bit different. What we're going to actually look is, for lack of a better term, is 2 classic histories of the past in the Pacific. One which has become one of the central hub fascinations of the Western world, and one, Madol, which is entirely vanished, or never grew in interest. In fact, let me very quickly do this one more time while I'm talking here. I'm just trying to pull up some images here that I can use. Okay. So first, let's go back to Polynesia, and let's take a look at this. Okay, so here we have the Eastern Pacific. We're up here. This is the Tuamotus over here. If you remember, I think I mentioned Pitcairn, which is the Polynesians settled there about, we estimate about 800 years ago, stayed for a while, then left. In the 1700s, the Bounty mutineers, the British naval ship where the crew mutinied, abducted a bunch of Tahitian women and a few of the guys and settled in Pitcairn. And there's still a community there now of their descendants. It's a minor tourist interest attraction. It's probably more interesting for just sort of the whole history of the British Navy hunting them down, and just, you know, there's Mutiny on the Bounty movies and books, and I mean, just it goes on and on and on. But it's a sort of fascinating piece of Pacific Island history. Probably most interesting from our standpoint is the fact that the folks that mutiny you have to remember, military mutinies mean that that's punishable by death. They take you out and push you in front of a firing squad. So these guys, when they did this, which they did in Tahiti, they knew that the British Navy was going to literally hunt every single one of them down until they were dead. So it says something, one, about their view of British naval discipline and how horrible it was in their late 1700s. But it also says something about how the stereotype of Polynesia as Eden as a place to escape from the realities of the, quote, modern world back in the day were so strong that you'd actually take this risk literally of your life just to achieve this fantasy. And at least for some of it, you know, I suppose it paid off, and their descendants are still here. So it gives you an idea of how powerful the image of Polynesia was to Europeans, and then of course in a later period of time, Americans, in the sense of Anglo-Americans. So if we go east of this, if you notice, there's absolutely nothing here. Pitcairn is absolutely middle of nothing. There's some reefs off of here, and then that's flat out it. Notice how far you then have to go. I believe it's another 700 or 800 miles, I'm just guessing, before you get to Easter Island. Now, Easter Island was also settled by Polynesians. There's, as with all the rest of the Polynesian stuff, there's this absolutely, you know, huge amount of energy and effort spent on like who first settled in Polynesia, or in Easter Island, Rapa Nui. When did it happen? You know, Just as a technical point, Easter Island now belongs to Chile, which is a whole other thing. But Polynesians settled here. It's very clear that when they settled here, they arrived here by choice. But all the evidence suggests that when they arrived here, they weren't able to get off. And there's a pretty simple reason for that, is there's absolutely no good beaches on the island. I think the only one is down, maybe it's up here. Oh, maybe. Yeah, this is the only good beaches right here. So you can imagine you come ashore, here's a little trading boat off of here. Imagine you're coming ashore in an 80 to 120-foot canoe, heavily with people, and you're running short of provisions probably, because you're talking roughly 1,400 miles from the Marquesas. And then the population is coming from the Marquesas to a Motus group. That's linguistic and genetic evidence is that. So you try to find a place to land. If you notice this place is totally unfriendly, you basically have no really effective beaches. That isn't actually the beach. I think the beach is on the side. You've got one place here that has an illusion of being a beach. You can't find it, but it's not really. It's sort of a dangerous illusion. So what you've got here is a pretty massively unfriendly to boat place. We'll say hypothetically, the conditions are good and you land here, this rock shelf. Now you've got several problems, and the only other place you would have seen, well, you haven't seen them yet because they haven't gone there yet, but you're going to get these same type of problems when you land in Aotearoa, New Zealand, because here also you're on the colder waters of the Pacific. You do not have coral reefs. So if you notice, you can see this pretty obvious here. You don't see these breaking waves out here on a reef formation. You see these breaking waves literally on the land. The evidence suggests that the ship made it ashore safely. They were able to move the people and the provisions off, and then they got their butt handed to them. And if you visualize, coming in here, for example, that's not hard to imagine. If you come in, conditions are good, and all of a sudden, you get a westerly swell coming in, or just a storm front, or even a squall coming in, and bang, you're minus a boat. So Rapa Nui is interesting because it's the quintessential example of a Polynesian population intentionally migrating to a location, but without really understanding. Now, it's not that they didn't understand the consequences of it, it's just that they weren't able to deal with the consequences of it because they were unable to get home. And the reason is very simple: because of the climate of this, because of the location, significantly cooler, for example. It's sort of like it's like the southern middle half of Aotearoa. So it's very much temperate. Think of sort of a climate like maybe Northern California, Oregon, or something like that. So what you find here is the vegetation has nothing to do with the rest of the Pacific. The vegetation here is actually sort of a weird combination of some Polynesian stuff and some stuff from South America. The main plant or the main tree cover on the island was a type of palm. It's sort of like, I guess, like the ornamental date palms you see around here now. You actually find a similar, a related variety in the Nui-mysteries Marquesas group. Is not quite the same. So this actually had its own, endemic species of plants, and to a certain extent probably flightless bird in terms of animals. But you're not going to get what you would have in the rest of the Pacific. You don't have any fringing reef, which means you don't have any fishing. You don't have any shellfish collecting. It's significantly cooler. Unlike Aotearoa, it's not a really big piece of real estate, and it's not far enough south to have, penguins and walrus or seals and all that stuff like that. So it's pretty much, it's a high island. It's a volcanic island. You can see the major volcano here, but it's not a really attractive place to set up shop. So what happens is the Polynesians arrive here. They don't have any choice. Their ship is basically broken for all intents and purposes. There's no oral traditions in the Tuamotus and Marquesas of a voyage going east. And it appears to be pretty much typical in the Polynesian region. If a voyage is unsuccessful, and it's not a major expedition voyage, it just sort of drops off the charts. So in the case of Hawaii, you have constant folks going down, you have folks coming up, again, the Pao guys coming up from Marquesas Tahiti. In the case of Aotearoa, that's a major, massive migration, a number, a whole expedition of colonizing canoes, basically. So that stays in the memory of the people in both locations. This doesn't. So we don't have any oral tradition evidence in the Tuamotus, which is probably where they launched from, of an expedition to Rapa Nui. And we don't have anything in the Rapa Nui oral tradition, which is very fragmented. that gives us an idea of where they came from, the Tuamotus. So there's no genealogy chants, for example, that actually link to genealogies in the Tuamotus Marquesas region in terms of, you know, these families came from such and such. The naming of places in Rapa Nui doesn't necessarily, in fact, in many cases, doesn't appear to follow the patterns of ancestral naming you find in the rest of Polynesia. So something happens, and that's sort of one of the mysteries. And it's not surprisingly, what it undoubtedly had to do with is the fact that when they move here, just basically everything on their canoe won't grow. You have to remember this. Excuse me, this island doesn't have sweet potatoes ever show up. So they don't have access to that one plant resource that makes Aotearoa a tremendous success. No, I'm sure sweet potatoes probably grow really well there now. So all the traditional crops, breadfruit, dalo, etc., all those, even the dryland varieties, they don't grow. So your traditional food crops, which you've had thousands of years of experience with, don't grow at all. Now this makes it radically different both in Aotearoa and especially in Hawaii, which are also cooler. But at least you've got a, you know, you've got the potential for something that you're used to. Here, there's no potential at all. So as far as we can tell, what happens is the population in Rapa Nui manages to save a couple of the dryland plants. Some of the dryland yams survive, but again, they grow very, very poorly, very, very slow. And they have to do a fairly complicated process because they're very susceptible to cold spells. It actually gets frost on this island. And as you can imagine, tropical plants are not particularly happy with things like frost. So what happens is they find themselves turning back into what you might call hunter-gatherers. They apparently try to sort of cultivate the palm tree because it actually comes up with a, geez, I don't know what the size would be. It's smaller than a baseball, so like a racquetball or maybe a tennis ball size nut that ends up being one of the main food sources. So what you end up is largely a starch-based diet. There's birds, but the birds are fairly hard to catch, and they probably go through them really quickly. In terms of flightless species, quickly disappear. We think there are at least 3 or 5 flightless species. So the human population pretty much finds itself having to just basically scour the landscape and eat whatever they can find. Now they've also got another problem, and that's the fact that what you have is very much like what we have the dryland forest here. You apparently had these palm trees as your main vegetation base, and then you had what is sort of grassy clumps. What you didn't have is a real complex vegetative system like you had here in Hawaii. So whereas in Hawaii you have basically 15 to 30 different species of plants in the dryland, you know, sort of upland zone, which would be somewhat similar to this. Think of Waimea, for example, on the Big Island. Here, what you basically have is, as far as we can tell, about 3 or 6 plants. So it's a very uncomplicated, very simplistic biotic system that the Polynesians arrive in. And a lot of it doesn't really lend itself to anything of particular utility. Palm trees, if you're familiar with them, and in fact, this particular species of palm, as far as we know, was almost more like a banana. It's a very soft trunk, it's a very soft wood. So among other things, it would have been almost impossible to make anything useful out of it. It's not as hard as a niu or a coconut. So you couldn't carve a replacement canoe, or for example, even make parts for a canoe. You might have had some driftwood come ashore, which would be logical. But again, given its location, the fact that it's not in the main currents, you're not going to get a lot of driftwood. It's not like Hawaii. So, you know, pretty much what you got, what you see is what you get. And there's not much here in what you see that's actually useful. So the population very quickly ends up in sort of a desperate situation. They end up in a situation where they have to completely reinvent themselves in an environment that's not particularly attractive to human occupation, given the repertoire of things that Polynesians had. So the end result of all this is they go through some pretty radical changes. And there's been a ton of books written on Rapa Nui, and feel free to go and look at whatever ones you want. I'm just trying to find one of them. Okay, here we go. One of the side effects of this is that things that you would have done in wood in the Marquesas or Tuamotus group, you're not going to do in wood here for the simple reason that you don't got no wood. And whatever wood you need to for two things. You need it for, it's the plants that you eat to survive, so you can't cut them down. And secondly, is you need firewood. This is an environment where you need to have fire a large number of nights of the year. And you're in this horrible situation where if you stay warm at night, that's from cutting down the trees that you need to eat the nuts off of. So you're trapped in this sort of catch-22. And you have to remember, it gets cold enough in this colder season in Rapa Nui that you can end up with hypothermia and die from that before the morning. So your only option is to burn the grasses. Now, the environment you see here in this particular image is a classic, like here in Hawaii. This is what happens when you bring in grazing animals. But the interesting thing is when the European accounts, when they arrive in the, I believe, 1620, I can't remember when the Dutch expedition arrives. When the Dutch and then later the French and the British and everyone arrive here, they're all very adamant that the environment they saw looks pretty much like what you see now. It was just really pretty much not a lot there. And that sort of makes sense because it wouldn't have been grazing animals. It would have been sort of like grazing people. People would have been taking the grasses, anything they could get, and burning them just to stay from freezing. And if you know anything about grasses, burning grasses is pretty useless for staying warm for any more than a couple of minutes, like burning paper. The grass goes up very quickly, it generates a lot of smoke, and in 5 minutes, the amount of grass you would have to burn on a daily basis to even sort of survive with any sort of warmth would have been sort of mind-blowing, and not particularly the good ones here, and not particularly advantageous. So what you get is this sort of classic, enormous problem, for lack of a better term, and that is like, how do we make this work? And one of the side effects of it is that you convert, not surprisingly, which makes sense because it's a classic human response, is when you're in desperation, what you do is you reach to other parts of things that might give you an answer to those things that you can't deal with. And not surprisingly, what happens is religion becomes in a total logical way, becomes one of the things that you start to reach out to. And in this particular situation, what you do is you go back to this invocation of ancestors. Now, in the Tuamotus, what you find is your marae will have carved wooden images of ancestors, very similar to what you see here in Hawaii, though they're different design. What you find in Rapa Nui is those same images get expanded in size and they become made in stone, soft stone, which when you think about it makes sense. You don't have wood to spare. Now, what's interesting is these things start fairly small and they get bigger and bigger and bigger. And this, of course, becomes the famous or infamous Easter Island stone statues. And here's one mine on its back. Here's a set that have been put back on the marae. So what you have here, what we would call ki, here in Hawaii or the rest of Polynesia, become called moai in here, and that's actually also Marquesan Tuamotu term for particular types of ki. And this becomes, of course, the huge fascination. This becomes the tourist attraction that is Rapa Nui / Easter Island, is these infamous images. Because what you get is then when Europeans see these things, given their stereotype of Polynesians, because remember, they immediately recognize that the Easter Island folks are Polynesians, is Polynesians wouldn't be able to make stuff like this because Polynesians don't live in a world where they have the quote technical skills or interest in making things like that. So therefore, outsiders must have made them. Now, in the 19th, early mid-20th century, right into the 1950s, what you find is then you also have another thing. This becomes the centerpiece for the whole discussion about this part of the Pacific having a version of Atlantis, which then sinks in the ocean, and Easter Island becomes one of the last vestiges of remnants that show the evidence of the god, alien ancestor, whatever the hell you want to call it, who made this stuff, which disappear in the rest of Polynesia, as far as it goes. So this becomes the Easter Island thing. And here you see it ad infinitum. There's been a ton of videos done on this place. Most of them are incredibly humorous, unintentionally so. There's a bunch of videos that National Geographic just worn this place into the ground. They did a couple of really sort of hilariously bad videos, unintentionally, of archaeologists and engineers trying to figure out how you move these things around. Most of these are actually made from a stone in one particular quarry. So in many cases, these things were actually moved, almost across, in many cases, literally across the island. And that, of course, becomes yet another fascination for the outsiders: is how did this happen? This is just, these things just to become, if you just look at how did Easter Islands lift the statues, da 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 da. Somewhere down here we should have. We'll see, this is in the 1950s and through 1980s. This became the centerpiece for a whole series of arguments by pretty flaky people. Oh, sorry, it's my opinion. That actually insisted that this was done by aliens. If you go down here far enough, I can even find them anywhere. Some great images of alien spacecraft moving these suckers around. Oh, well, let me give up. This is actually what they looked like when they were in their original form. What we do know that happens is that somewhere in the 1700s, or well, actually no, 1600s, because the Rogvian expedition finds most of them have been knocked over by the time the British expedition shows up in 1720 or something like that. All of them have been knocked over. Cook shows up here and has an interesting report on what he sees. All of the Moai have been knocked over, and the Moai that they're based on have been pretty much busted up. So when you see one of these things standing up now, unless they're just image stuck on the hillside, they have been put back up. And in most cases, the eyes were picked out, and the top of the headdress, or the hair, or whatever you want to call it, on top of these was knocked over. So when these things are upright, that's not the way they looked when the Europeans were there. That was, they were all down. They weren't like this. And that becomes another one of the mysteries, because there's absolutely no doubt that the Rapa Nuians did this. So the Polynesians on Rapa Nui, for some reason, at some point in time, though it appears it not occurred, it occurred over about a 100-year period, dumped these suckers over. The oral traditions on Rapa Nui are very clear that it was part of a political infighting between different clans or families that controlled different parts of the island. But there was a consistent sort of two-party system, again, very typical in most of Polynesia. You had Adiki in charge, and you had the majority population of Manahune. And the general oral tradition on Rapa Nui is the Manahune were being overworked, given the shrinking amount of resources, and eventually they just say enough, and they just revolt, and these things get knocked over. By the time the European expeditions in the 1700s arrived, Cook's very clear of this. What they find is a population that's largely in starvation. A lot of them died. The Dutch probably, for example, brought some diseases with them. So the European expeditions leave disease behind. But the population also just sort of collapses due to agricultural problems. By the late 1600s, well, even by the Rogvian expedition, the trees are gone. The trees become extinct by the mid-late 1600s. So what happens is that you end up in a situation that the Polynesian population, for ritual or political or social reasons, basically wipes itself out of its environment. They destroy their own environment prior to the European arrival. And the Europeans just sort of showing up for a day or two, checking this place out. Are oftentimes pretty bummed, because they're stopping here thinking they just come around South America, for example. They need food, they need water. They come here and they find that the locals are trying to beg food and water off of them. And they're sort of like, dude, we're short. So on one hand, there's this tremendous fascination with the stone images, the key of the island. On the other hand, there was this puzzle of this disconnect, you might say, between the population living on the island and the physical remnants that you see of the island. Now let's segue to what we should have been talking about this today, which is, I assume this is still showing up. Here's Nan Madol, which is that short video. Here in a very different way, you see something actually pretty similar. Absolutely massive, massive, massive series of structures, and not just one structure, a whole pile of stuff here. It's kind of, well, I think yeah, here we go. Here's a image that actually gives an idea of this. Now, it's not the only one of these. There's actually 3 of these that I'm aware of. There's one here, there's another one on another part of Polynesia, and there's also one in Costa Rica somewhere, although they're considerably smaller. So there's not just one but it's not found in other parts of the islands in central Micronesian region, and it's not found anywhere else in Micronesia. There's nothing else like this in the rest of the Pacific period. Absolutely massive, massive walled structures. And again, just sort of mind-blowing the size of these things. And here gives you guys, remember this wall's going up for another 4 meters higher than these people are. So, these absolutely, stunning structures and stunning, sort of urbanized or ritualized center. And so in this context, we have sort of 2 interesting things. Again, when you talk to the existing population in Polynesia, their knowledge of the place is incredibly limited. All they have is a couple of sort of, stories that tie into, rulers or chiefs, high chiefs that abuse the population who eventually rise in revolt due to the, intercession of a group of outsiders who come to the island and sort of rescue the Manahune, if you would, from the Ariki. And the end result is that the place falls into disrepair and everyone leaves. There's rumors, which there's actually a little bit of archaeological evidence that Gananger did, a French archaeologist in the 1960s or 70s, I'm going to say late 60s, did when he excavated part of the central complex of ritual cannibalism in some of the human material, which is also part of the existing oral tradition, is that the folks that had this built, the Ariki that ran this place, developed a taste for people, basically consuming the Manahune of their own population, which then eventually, that population, not surprisingly, rises in revolt and boom, the place goes down. So we know very little about non-Madol. It wasn't mapped. It's now been mapped, I believe, 4 or 5 different times. I know actually one of the folks when I was in the archaeology program at UH was out there mapping non-Madol, and about 4 years after she mapped it, someone else went and mapped it again. So that place has been mapped up to its eyeballs. I don't know that the other 2 centers have been. I know that there's been some work done, but I don't think they've had the same level of investigation. So in the archaeological community, this is the only major place of interest in all of Micronesia. But as I note in the reaction question is, what's really interesting is there's absolutely no tourism related to it. So you've got this enormous, massive series of structures, very photogenic, at least as far as I would see. I think maybe in part because it's a tropical island, so it's a little harder to get a grasp of the size of it, so maybe it's not visually striking as a group of statues. You've got a large population living there, and the rest of the island's pretty much intact, so maybe it doesn't have that same intriguing interest. For whatever set of reasons, you just don't get that same compelling fascination with the place. Let's segue here and take a look at it. So let's zip over to non-Madol. Maybe in part just because it's not isolated, maybe because it's part of a large island, relatively large island, who knows. But everything you see here in this image, including this section here, all of this is artificial. So everything from here over to here has actually been built on reef. So what you had was a low reef, and what people did is moved absolutely tons and tons and tons of huge rock material out here to build this entire complex, and you can sort of see when you look at this thing, obviously none of this is natural. This whole thing is just one massive rock linear system. The main central complex is the one here that you see in all those other images. But if you notice, that's just part of a really, really big thing. But it says something sort of interesting. It's now completely overrun with mangroves, which has done a huge amount of damage to it. That there's no particular motivation by anyone to go in and, for example, clear this and keep it cleared, promote tourism. I don't know, maybe tourism would be a bad idea here, but But the fact that it just hasn't happened or no one's even brought it up as a major part of discussion gives you an idea. Now, this gives you some idea. This is not exactly a huge chunk of territory, but it's next to, it's basically almost like a peninsula of the main island of Pohnpei. I can't believe, I think Rome Tiki is, I think it's near Rome Tiki or someplace is the other smaller center, but I don't know, or no, it's Polynesia. But you have to go in and go fish that out. I don't, to be honest, I don't particularly remember. I got the evidence somewhere if someone's interested. So what you've got is this massive, you know, if you look at it, obviously, entirely artificial complex. And yet there's very little in the oral traditions of the population that we have access to that brings it up. Here we go. That ain't natural either. I mean, that's simple. So there's sort of a tradition, at least in Pohnpei, of these massive, you know, sort of architectural features. And again, that's entirely visualized. That serves no function. In fact, you can see the original structures inside. So, you know, as far as I know, I've never even heard of that place. So even literally just screwing around in Google Earth, you can find other pieces of other things. And I don't know that any of it's actually, other than the enormous amount of work, because there were National Geographic grants. I think the US government poured some money in the 70s, Park Service. You know, it's just sort of out there, but it says something about Micronesia in general, that you can have these massive engineering feats that are entirely out of the scale of anything else in the Pacific, that just sort of go, boop. But it also says something about the variety that you have in this particular region, that between here and its nearest large neighbor, which also has one or two, you know, I forget. In fact, I bet you if we went around and actually spent some time going around this island in Google Earth, I bet you there's probably 2 or 3 similar type of things. So what you get is this pair of islands and the related reefs that sort of tie them all together, do their own thing, which looks really, really, really different than anywhere else in Micronesia. Having said that, one of the main things you do see that you still see in this region is the longhouses. And a lot of the social structure looks like the rest of Micronesia, except it's actually much more, it's almost like Hawaii to a certain extent, and say, well, Marquesas. So what you find in this area is very, very rigid social structure with ariki, with tremendous amounts of authority. But these are family, again, like their Samoan counterparts with Matai. These are folks who are tied to authority by family. They're not tied to authority by purely sort of a class or caste designation. So unlike Hawaii and to a certain extent the Marquesas, Tuamotus, Tahiti group, what you don't get is a separate caste of elites. As with traditional Central Polynesia, what you end up is the heads of family are your elites, and particular branches of the family are the ones who generate the Matai, which is true in Samoa Tonga, for example. What happens in this part of Micronesia, however, is that it gets amplified, and what you end up with is a very restricted group of members in a family who can be the ariki, and they have a stunning amount of authority, which actually looks a lot like the ariki or the, for example, here, which might explain the large structural patterns here. But again, the oral traditions are what little has been collected. Again, despite the fascination with these structures, there's been very little work. And in fact, I don't know of any work done in Kosovo at all in terms of collating and collecting oral traditions. And of course, the sad thing is that by 2020, most of those oral traditions have long since vanished because we have the impact of the American influence, westernization, not to mention the Japanese in the early first half of the 20th century. So the end result of all that is we have this other mystery. If the stone key and Rapa Nui Easter Island are one mystery, the other mystery would again be in stone, of the massive sort of urban or ritual centers that you find in only these 2 islands in the entire chain of the Micronesian region. So that's the end of mystery 2, you might say.